Islamic extremists armed with guns and throwing grenades stormed a hotel in Mali Friday.
They say this entire area is crawling with al-Qaeda-affiliated militants.
Islamic extremism is on the rise in West Africa.
There were more than 200 terrorist attacks by groups aligned with al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, as jihadist groups are digging in deeper in their most promising home outside of the Middle East.
For years, Mali has been battling jihadists linked to al-Qaeda and ISIS with the support of French troops.
Once again, terrorists want to make their barbaric presence felt everywhere, where they can kill, where they can massacre.
However, a 2020 military coup and another a year later prompted a diplomatic fallout. And in February, France announced it was withdrawing its forces.
Nous ne pouvons pas rester engagés militairement aux côtés d'autorités de fait dont nous ne partageons ni la stratégie ni les objectifs cachés.
As relations soured, Mali looked to one of the world's most notorious mercenary groups to fill the void.
Wagner. They're mostly ex-military, working for a notorious private military company which has close ties to Putin and his allies.
It's the latest African country to turn to Russian mercenaries, as Moscow capitalizes on weak governments and military coups to further its ambitions on the continent.
Russia has quickly become a power broker in Africa.
But many fear the consequences for countries already struggling with violence and corruption.
Russian mercenaries in the Central African Republic facing multiple allegations of war crimes, including torture, rape, and murder.
There's no accountability, there's no contracts, they can do whatever they want.
Every place that Russian mercenaries have gone, we've seen more instability, not less.
They have no interest in peace. By definition, they want the conflict to continue.
So how is Moscow exploiting chaos to expand its influence in Africa? And are Russian mercenaries providing the security they promise, or only fueling bloodshed in countries desperate for peace?
Мы продолжаем свою работу. Собаки лают, караван идет.
This new wave of Russian involvement in Africa can be traced outside of the continent to the 2014 conflict in Ukraine. It was the first appearance of the Wagner Group, a shadowy network of mercenaries that emerged to support pro-Russian separatists in the east.
The mysterious, unidentified fighters, dubbed Little Green Men, helped Moscow wrest the province from Ukraine, even as the Kremlin feigned ignorance.
A year later, Russia backed the authoritarian Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, helping him defeat a popular insurgency. These were some of the first signs of a new foreign policy playbook in Africa, where Russia supports proxies to gain a foothold on the continent.
Moscow learned that it can be opportunistic and prop up beleaguered autocrats in the world who are isolated politically, and in the process dramatically expand Moscow's geopolitical posture.
In 2017, one of those beleaguered autocrats was Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir, who enlisted Russia's help to bolster his fragile regime. A year later, as widespread protests broke out against his rule, leaked documents suggest Wagner operatives advised Bashir on how to suppress the dissent. And Russian-speaking mercenaries were spotted on the streets of Khartoum.
In January, activists circulated images of heavily armed men observing the process. Government and military sources in Sudan say they were private Russian contractors.
Despite their efforts, protests continued, and Bashir was later removed by the military. In return for its support, Moscow secures valuable mining concessions from Sudan, the continent's third largest gold producer.
They can try to get their hands on mining operations or mining zones, either for Russian companies to come in or to ship out gold or diamonds from any given country.
Sudan experienced yet another coup in 2021.
For democracy in Sudan, hanging by a thread. The army seizing control in an apparent coup.
It's exactly these environments where Russia thrives. Russia maintained ties with the military brass who led the coup in an effort to retain its interests, and has since emerged as one of its boldest enablers. Across the continent, a pattern has begun to emerge in which undemocratic, corrupt regimes are vulnerable to Russia's predatory interests.
When they cannot look to the West for assistance, they will find someone who's not Western, who's willing to offer them something. And more often than not, Russia has been that someone.
Now, it's countries in the Sahel, like Mali, that are in the Kremlin sights. For years, the region has battled a jihadist insurgency.
ISIS-linked groups in this region have increased their activity, and the continent seems increasingly important to ISIS since the fall of its caliphate in Syria.
Former colonial power France has helped provide security, deploying thousands of troops to the region. But these efforts have failed to stem the violence.
Français bakase français gono igo go boray me idiro banda iro wakang irgo bade iro dogana de nirgapa.
There's huge anti-French sentiment among young people now. They feel more and more that France has failed, they need to go.
In 2020, mutinous soldiers overthrew Mali's elected government and consolidated power in a second coup 9 months later.
Global leaders fear this latest government overthrow could open a power vacuum in the country, which has been plagued by violence for years.
The move led to a fallout with France, which announced it was pulling out its forces after almost a decade. Now, as France withdraws, Russia has moved in. Moscow has provided weapons and training, and Wagner mercenaries started arriving late last year. The mercenary group has become a way for Moscow to achieve its goals at little cost.
Можешь нас называть Вагнер, Моцарт, Шуберт, Шопен, Стравинский. Это не меняет абсолютно никакого смысла. Мы остаемся российскими инструкторами с целью оказания помощи нуждающимся странам.
The Russians are simply stepping in to diminish Western influence, to enhance Russia's seeming power globally.
This strategy works for the Kremlin, which officially denies any connection to the group.
Мы не имеем отношения к деятельности каких-либо таких структур, которые созданы гражданами России.
The use of proxy actors like the Wagner Group gives Russia plausible deniability. So they get to be involved in an armed conflict without being an actual party to the armed conflict. Politically, it looks good in the sense that you don't have your own members of the armed forces coming back in body bags.
But for the countries it operates in, Wagner often comes with a heavy price. In Mali, mercenaries are accused of assisting in a massacre that killed 300 people in March 2022. And in the Central African Republic, one of the world's poorest countries, Wagner has been accused of torture, murder, and rape. But despite numerous reported incidents, the opaque nature of Wagner makes it near impossible to hold those responsible to account.
If you think about regular armed forces, you have a clear chain of command, you have them wearing uniforms. So if you've got a member of the army who's involved in a human rights violation, there's a possibility of being able to identify who that person is. But when you're talking about mercenaries, you don't have any of that structure there. That's hugely problematic.
As it expands its reach, Russia has another tactic at its disposal. Moscow is now the leading sponsor of disinformation in Africa, with at least 16 campaigns on the continent, according to the US-funded Africa Center for Strategic Studies.
There's been evidence that Russian operatives have run information or disinformation campaigns in countries from Madagascar to Nigeria to South Africa.
When it comes to meddling with democracy, the Kremlin has a long track record. In 2016, Russia used cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns to manipulate the US election.
The FBI, the CIA, and the NSA states that Vladimir Putin personally ordered a cyber and social media campaign to disrupt the recent US presidential election.
2 years later, Russia brought this new brand of election interference to Madagascar. Russian operatives bribed candidates to drop out the race, created newspapers to spread disinformation, and paid young people to attend rallies.
was a strategic meddling and strategic influencing of almost all candidates and see how they could basically rig the election in somebody's favor.
Elsewhere on the continent, pro-Russian propaganda takes many different forms.
If you look at Central African Republic, you'll see billboards, there are statues praising Wagner.
Last year, thousands of Central Africans gathered at a stadium for the premiere of a film starring Russian paramilitaries.
In this recent movie, Tourist, funded by a company associated with the Russian mercenaries, they are lauded as heroic defenders who have liberated Central Africa.
It's created a very pro-Russian impression and the role that Russia is somehow playing the savior in these countries.
These tactics sow doubt in the democratic process, causing more instability.
For Russia, there is no such thing as having honest versus, disingenuous information. All kinds of information can be used as a weapon of war.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year has had far-reaching global ramifications. For Moscow, gaining new allies and winning the information war against the West is more important than ever.
Russia's desire to receive international support for its action in Ukraine forced Russia to find alternative trading and diplomatic partners, and Africa was the next stop.
And its efforts are working. In March, when the UN voted to reprimand Russia for invading Ukraine, many African countries chose neutrality.
Almost half of the countries who chose to abstain from condemning the Kremlin's actions at the UN General Assembly meeting earlier this month are in Africa.
Competing against other superpowers, such as the US and China, Russia is eager to prove it has a place not just in Africa, but on the global stage.
Africa, for them, seems to be a very convenient podium to make new friends and to show that it counts in the world. It's not just France, it's not just the West, but Russia is here also.
At the first Russia-Africa summit in 2019, President Vladimir Putin made it clear that Africa was a foreign policy priority.
Our cooperation, which goes back to the period of joint fight against colonialism, is of strategic and long-term nature.
But it is African citizens who have the most to lose in Moscow's geopolitical gambit.
Russia is not interested in human rights, and Russia is not interested in free media. And I think that in itself can be destabilizing.
If you look at countries like Central African Republic, there is still no peace. And many people will say where Russia passes, the area is ruined. They get in, they ruin the whole thing, extract resources, and they leave.